Plan on flying? It's time to upgrade to a real ID. Because in order to board domestic flights, your driver's license or state-issued ID must be a real ID, or you'll need another acceptable form of identification. So don't wait. Find out how to get your real ID at tsa.gov/realid. That's tsa.gov/realid, or visit your local DMV. And then you'll be cleared for takeoff.
As we wave a grateful farewell to the 2024 National League Division Series, I want to take a moment and notice the Padres roster and how diverse it is in terms of national origin. Game 5 of the series, which just concluded with a Dodgers victory, as I'm speaking these words, featured a matchup of Japanese starting pitchers, Misters Yoshinobu Yamamoto and Yu Darvish, with Shohei Ohtani in the mix, which is neat in and of itself. But consider San Diego's starting lineup from Game 4. Luis Arraez, first base, from Venezuela. Fernando Tatis in right field, born in San Pedro de Macorís of the Dominican Republic. Jurickson Profar in left field was born in Curacao. Manny Machado, the third baseman, born in the United States in Miami, Florida. Jackson Merrill, the center fielder, was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and went to high school in Severna Park near Annapolis. Xander Humphrey Bogaerts, the shortstop, hails from Oranjestad, the capital of Aruba. David Peralta, the designated hitter, was, like Arraez, born in Venezuela. Jake Cronenworth, the second baseman, hails from St. Clair, Michigan, which lies between Detroit and Lake Huron. Kyle Higashioka, the catcher, is of Japanese-American ancestry, with a grandpa who served in the 100th Infantry Battalion of Japanese Americans, those soldiers who had heretofore racistly been designated potential traitors. Their insignia included the motto, "Remember Pearl Harbor," which seems designed to reassure anyone who ran into them where their affiliation lay. Their associates in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had the motto, "Go for broke," which captures the attitude of men who felt they had to prove themselves and therefore suffered one of the highest casualty rates of the war. It's also the title of the 1951 MGM film about the unit, which starred the wooden Van Johnson. I constantly debate whether I'm unfair to Van Johnson when I call him wooden. Kyle is from Huntington Beach, California, which is on the coast south of Anaheim. Dylan Cease, their starter in Game 4, is from Milton, Georgia, which I think is fairly described as a suburb of Atlanta. It also furnished a co-founder of Lynyrd Skynyrd, Freebird. We should also note that, were he healthy, infielder Ha-Sung Kim of Bucheon, South Korea, not far from Seoul, would be playing, and that Donovan Solano from lovely Barranquilla, Colombia, plays quite often as well, particularly against left-handed pitching. I don't think it's odd to consider a diverse roster of value in and of itself. It happens the Padres have cast a wide net, and they win, or at least this year they won up through Game 3 of the series just ended. But you could certainly have the United Nations roster and not win. The only value in terms of team building is talent, and yet baseball exists in multiple dimensions at once, and we can appreciate the construction of the team even if it isn't going to win a championship, even if it didn't qualify for the playoffs. We can appreciate it at least in this particular aspect. In the absence of world harmony and the continuance of man's inhumanity to man, the Padres will have to do until the real thing comes along. That is, this is a value to be cultivated, not fought against. That is very much part of what is at stake in our current election. It is, among other things, a contest of values in this regard, which is to say, those who would look at the diversity of the Padres roster and say that it is a proud example of what baseball can accomplish when it is race blind, color blind, religion blind, nationality blind, and those who say that, as happened to be said today at one rally by one of the major candidates, that America should be only for, quote, Americans. However you define that. It isn't defined, but you can guess. Given that the comments that frame that sort of statement are usually about the same people from the same parts of the world, you know who is included and who is excluded. as the days dwindle down to a precious few before we get to November, we really have a choice to make in this regard. It will define our country, if not for all time, certainly for a long time. Increasingly, I feel like the state of humanity is that of the last two dinosaurs arguing about which one is going to get to eat the scraps of a third dinosaur. In such situations, there is always the temptation to turn inward, to become insular, to protect what you've got, and circle the wagons against those who are outside. But no country, no people truly thrives when it turns its back on the world, and the United States in particular has always depended on an influx of energy from the outside, jolt us along from one era to the next. There was, shall we say, over 100 years, but not that much more, from the start of the industrialized era to the birth of the atomic bomb. And both of those developments, or that period, bookended by industrialization and then the apogee of what industrialization made possible, this ability to rend the atom and destroy the world. Well, they both actually set us up to destroy the world in different ways, whether by heating ourselves to death or coughing ourselves to death or mercury poisoning, not to mention every other damn substance. Anyone up for some phosphogypsum? It's nice and radioactive. Or have you spent any time thinking about the acidification of the ocean lately? I don't recommend it, but it's sort of important that we do. Depending on how you want to frame things, you can take it from, say, 1820 or from 1945, but from either of those moments, a baby struggled to be born, and it was a baby with a gun to its head. It's a new world baby. I realize that sounds sort of hippie-ish or 1970s Aquarian-ish or however you want to dismiss it, but it's the truth. It's a child that recognizes that we are all in this together. As Benjamin Franklin said, we must hang together or we will most assuredly hang separately. There's only one lifeboat and we live on it. And there's an instinct, a sort of primal human fear that's like the end of the Titanic, whether the movie or the real event, where people in the water are struggling to pull themselves into the lifeboat and some of the more selfish passengers are beating them back saying, "No, you'll swamp us." How do you suppose those folks lived with themselves after? Some of them probably had no problem at all, and some of them felt quite guilty. And that, in a nutshell, is our election. The Padres represent the possibility of an America that recognizes the interconnectedness of the world and the potential that that recognition can provide us. In 1953, Casey Stengel was talking up his team, a team that had just won 4 straight World Series and was on its way to winning a 5th. He said, "It's that carry-on spirit that the Yankees have, and everybody in the country wants somebody to be a Yankee or live like a Yankee, which don't mean just baseball, but to be somebody for the United States." If someone outside wants to come in and be somebody for the United States, we should want them, whether they want to be a doctor or a nurse or a teacher, or they just want to pull carrots out of the ground. We need that carry-on spirit to fill in any gaps where those who are already here haven't done the work themselves. Remember what JFK said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Well, many are asking, and our reply is, go away, you eat cats. Go away, or we'll put you in a cage and send you back to some random place. We don't really care where you came from, as long as you go back there. The great pitcher, Louis Tiant, passed away this week at the age of 83. I'll say a few more words about him in a few minutes, but I'm sure that you don't need me to go over his resume by now. It was all over the place the last few days, and you're probably familiar with it if you're a listener to this program, but he was just a great charismatic pitcher, finishing in the top 10 in the annual Cy Young Award voting 3 times, in the top 10 of the MVP voting twice. In 1968, he went 21-9 with a league-leading 1.60 ERA, but that was the year Denny McLain swept all the awards by winning 31 games. On a WAR basis, El Tiante was better, but no one was thinking in those terms back then. So the generally reprehensible Mr. McLain was a unanimous winner, and Tiant's season didn't even get an honorable mention. He won 20 or more games 4 times, including that season, had a second ERA title later, and, after some arm problems, invented the crafty delivery for which he's remembered, with the ratcheting arms and his back turned to home plate. I believe that is part of his heritage from the Negro Leagues, where such unorthodox deliveries were employed by some very successful pitchers. I bring up the Negro Leagues in the context of his life pointedly because it played a great part in it. Pursuant to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago or moments ago, he was born in Cuba, the son of a Negro Leagues great. And to say that somebody was a Negro Leagues great is to say that they were the victim of discrimination, full stop, because they were good enough to play anywhere, and they played in the United States, but they didn't play at what we all agree was the highest level of that time, the American and National Leagues. His dad pitched here, primarily for the New York Cubans, a team that was not composed entirely of Cubans. The name was just a clue, so no unsuspecting white people wandered in. Toward the end of his career, when he was approaching his 40th birthday, he was teammates with Minnie Minoso. That was 1946 and 1947. Minoso was young enough to get a chance in the big leagues once the color line began to give way in that latter season, but it was already too late for Louis Sr. I think one of the richest ironies of his son's life was that as the revolution turned Cuba into a dictatorship, one that increasingly tried to imprison its citizens on that island, he was able to escape because of pitching badly. The future El Tiante couldn't get his career going as a teen pitcher in Cuba, but he was scouted by Bobby Avila, the former Cleveland second baseman and star of the 1954 team. He won the AL batting title that year, and he recommended Louis to the Mexico City Tigers. So for 2 years, Louis pitched in Mexico City in the summers and then went home to Cuba to see his folks and play winter ball. He was 18, 19. It was like he went away to college, just backwards, away for the summer and home for the winter instead of the other way around, as it is for most kids. Most American kids, I should say. During his third summer, he married a woman from Mexico, and he was going to bring her home to meet the folks, but the Castro regime was cracking down, especially on young men, when it came to leaving the country. And so his dad said, "Don't come." That was 1961. He didn't see his parents again until 1975, when Senators Edward Brooke III and George McGovern intervened with Castro to allow his parents to come to Boston to see him pitch. Edward Brooke III, Massachusetts Senator, Republican; George McGovern, Democrat of South Dakota. Louis Tiant Sr. threw out the first pitch at Fenway Park before the game of August 26th that year. I was looking at pictures of that just now, and I choked up, not just because of that long-delayed family reunion with Louis Tiant looking on proudly at his father, but because this was Fenway Park. This was the Red Sox, the last team to integrate, because someone shouted, "Get those N-words off the field," when Jackie Robinson tried out there, because in his prime, Louis Tiant Sr. would not have been allowed to pitch off of that mound or any other like it anywhere in the United States of America. But here, decades later, he was being honored in this greatest of all ballparks, or one of the greatest of all ballparks. I don't want to offend anyone who's partisan for their local stadium/giant ashtray. A reporter jokingly asked Tiant Sr., who was about 69 at this point, whether he was ready to pitch for the Red Sox. "You tell the Red Sox I'm ready," he said. His son added, "He told me he was ready to go 4 or 5 innings. And it's cute, but it's also heartbreaking, because he should have been able to do that 40 years earlier. But he asked America, and America refused him." Let's close the circle now. Again, one of the senators I just mentioned was a Republican, the other a Democrat. Brooke was an African-American, a moderate Republican. That species is extinct now. He broke with his party in 1964 when it nominated the bigoted, then far-right Senator Barry Goldwater for president, but he did stay in the, quote, big tent of the GOP. McGovern was one of the most liberal Democrats and his party's nominee for president in 1972, getting swamped by Richard Nixon. Brooke liked Nixon. He and McGovern worked together to do this good thing for the Tiant family. That's what governments are for, to boost us up, not drag us down, to protect us, not to frighten us, to aid us, not exploit us, to bring us together instead of push us apart. I realized that Louis Tiant Sr. and his wife were elderly people who couldn't plausibly be called murderers or escapees from jail or an asylum, who were being sent here from Latin America to take our jobs, our houses, and eat fluffy, but in the sense that they had to be coaxed out from under a dictator. They weren't too different from the majority of those unfortunate souls who come here to be happier than they were where they began. It's just, in the Tiant's case, their kid was famous, so they got a break that wasn't forthcoming for any of 7 or 8 million other Cubans or all those other people who we are arguing about today. And not only that, but the government, the United States government, allowed the Tiants to extend their stay for the brief time remaining in their lives. Both died days apart in December 1976 and are interred in Massachusetts. The honor is all Massachusetts, too. Happiness, friends. It's about the pursuit of happiness. We may only go round this one time, and there's nothing else worth getting while we're here. America provided that to the Tiants, and it could provide it to so many more if we weren't stingy about it, if we weren't encouraged to be fearful, and in the process, lift each other up too. The only alternative, and it isn't much of one, is the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, episode 302, in an ongoing series. I am Stephen Goldman, your host, for this journey to understanding the present via a trip to the past. And the 2024 Padres are now part of that past, the very recent past. Who knew that despite Dodgers pitching being so damaged, so short, at least on paper, that the Padres would just go to sleep for 2.5 games, be completely unable to hit. They won Game 3, but didn't score after the second inning, didn't score at all in Game 4, did not score at all in Game 5. My math is not great, but I do believe that adds up to 25 consecutive scoreless innings against the Padres offense or for Dodgers pitching, however you want to put it. It wasn't pretty, or it was very pretty depending on your point of view. I just know that going back at least to the couple of World Series when John McGraw's Giants beat the Yankees and shut down Babe Ruth in the process, he was hurt some of the time. You got all this bloviating, this self-congratulatory stuff from McGraw and the Giants about how their plans had defeated the Babe, as opposed to just, he went into a slump. We caught him when he was cold. We caught him when he was bleeding internally. We just got lucky. We got a few good bounces. And to this day, every time a new team wins a World Series, we get another book in the genre of how the New Zealand Zephyrs have hacked this thing. They've got the scouting know-how. They've got the front office know-how to win baseball. And there hasn't been a repeat winner since the 98, 99, 2000 Yankees. There have been a few repeat pennant winners. There have been teams like the Giants or the Red Sox who made it to the World Series or won the World Series kind of every other year for a while, but no one has this thing hacked. They just managed to put together a good team, and then entropy did what it always does. And of course, whatever insights they did have got absorbed into the general environment. Whatever edge that gave them was lost, and they were so brilliant they never thought of another one. How impressed are you in retrospect, 8 years on is it now, with the Cubs front office of 2016 and the job that they did? Were they really permanently brilliant or momentarily brilliant? Which is possibly not brilliant at all, but lucky. I don't mean to be unfairly critical of them. They won 100 games the year that they won the World Series, and then they kept winning 90 games for a couple of more years, but entropy does what it does. No one has figured out how to defeat that yet, except perhaps for the Yankees dynasty, which basically ran with interruptions from 1920 to 1964. and they had some advantages, some fair and some not, which aren't available anymore. It would be more honest to say that whereas no one really hacks baseball, every year a team figures out how to hack it for that year. If it were a skill, it would be repeatable. So there's an element of luck to it, which is to say they put together a good team, and for whatever reason, for many reasons, it coalesces in a given period of time, and then it can't do that again. I mentioned Donovan Solano earlier. He's fascinating in that he came up with the Marlins in 2012 and hit quite poorly for a number of years, averaging .257 with a .306 on base percentage, .331 slugging percentage in 370 games. And then he spent most of 3 years in the minors at lovely Scranton and Oklahoma City and unlocked some new skills. Giant scouts recognized this. There's a bit of a hack, and signed him in 2019. I assume his organizational depth, but it turned out they needed that depth, brought him up that May, and he ran with the opportunity. In about 550 games since then, he's hit .294 with a .353 on base and a .413 slugging percentage while playing first, second, and third. He's hit .305 against Southpaws. He didn't get the Ben Zobrist upgrade or anything, but he has value, part of this complete balanced roster. He's also a career .270 pinch hitter, which doesn't make him Manny Mota, but places him somewhere in the top 50 all time. He's already 36, so I don't know how long he can keep it up, but as a fan of redemption narratives, I'm rooting for him. I'm rooting for you, too. The difference is, now that the Padres are over for the year, Donovan Solano rooting goes into hibernation, but my rooting for you is evergreen. So, where do we go from here? In several recent episodes, I've said this one is going to be shorter than our usual lengthy, nigh untimed storytelling and discussion session, and usually that's turned out to mean at best that the show ran 55 minutes instead of 105, because the tales tend to grow in the telling. As you know, I work from notes, but not a script. That is very intentional. I don't want to read to you, but rather to discover the material along with you. That frees me to add or subtract, and also to mess up a lot, most of which you do not hear, or at least I hope you don't, because I'm sure I don't catch every trip of the tongue, or the odd occasions I absently call Ozzie Smith Otter Smythe or something. I don't know if that's a function of age, but I've always noticed it happening with older people, one of whom I am slowly becoming in spite of myself. My grandmother, who was quite sharp in most ways right until the end, would call me by my brother Elvis's name, and presumably she called Elvis Stephen. And of course, that tendency led directly to the infamous incident when she got on the public address system in Las Vegas after one of Elvis's shows and said, "I do not, or did not, have a brother named Elvis, but if I had had one, that's how it would have gone down." I do find myself doing that, and what it is, I think, is that in my old age, I have many thoughts running on separate tracks at the same time, but they start to jump them, and they all collide when I go to reach for a name, and sometimes in the wreckage of all of those lines of thought, I pick out the wrong one. It's very embarrassing. Upsetting for me, too, like it strikes at the heart of my identity because, as you've probably figured out, 7 years into the run of this program, a lot of that identity is centered on my knowing stuff. And if I'm pulling up Andrew Johnson when Andrew Jackson is required or vice versa, which is typically required of me no later than breakfast most days, then I'm not who I was. I think maybe I'll take up quadratic equations in my spare time. Maybe that'll help. So we will see how Act 2 of the show goes, but I intend for it to be comparatively brief because, as we've been saying, we are in the 2024 postseason. There is so much baseball going on, and you want to see it, and I want to see it, and I don't want to get in the way of that for either of us. Maybe you get up much earlier in the morning than I do and can do both. Well, go you. Shame on me. What else is new? Speaking of shame, in just a moment, I want to go back to some matters that came up in connection with my discussion of Pete Rose's passing last time around, but only in passing. That segment will not largely be about Rose, thank goodness, but I went by one thing too quickly, and I feel like I should clean that up a little, dilate on the subject a bit. So please sit back and relax, enjoy this brief intermission, and on the other side, we will visit the very early Negro Leagues. The pre-Negro Leagues, really.
John Henry was a steam driving man, drove steel all over the land. bed before I let that old stinger beat me down. I'll die with my hammer in my hand, Lord, Lord. Die with my hammer in my hand.
I just feel bad about Louis Tiant. Can't say that I ever really met him, but I was no more than a foot away from him on something like 4 to 6 occasions when I was in the pregame clubhouse prior to Yankees old timers days. They used to let you do that, and it was a real sad day for me when they stopped. I struck up conversations with many players in those days, and I cherish all of them. Most of them were really friendly and happy to talk, and I very much enjoyed seeing Tiant, who had spent 2 seasons with the Yankees towards the end of his career. He was instantly recognizable. His hair had gone white, but otherwise he looked pretty much exactly the same, was always animated, always seemed to enjoy himself, and I didn't talk to him, and I really regret that now. There were 3 reasons why I didn't talk to him. First, I usually had some story-driven agenda as to who to talk to and what topics I wanted them to address, and somehow he never made my list. There was very limited time to talk to those guys, so I had to pick my spots. Second, he was so garrulous, always having so much fun with his old friends, that he was inevitably in mid-conversation whenever I walked up, so I felt it would be wrong to interrupt. And the third reason was that this seems sad. It seems pathetic in some ways, but tobacco smoke really gets to me. I just have zero tolerance for it. Nausea hits me really quickly. And in those days, some of those older fellers felt free to light up in the Yankees clubhouse. One was Cliff Johnson, who I did force myself to talk to because I really wanted to hear what he had to say about the racial preferences demonstrated by the Astros when he was a catcher. He was a catching prospect, I should say, and I've quoted his words, or the gist of them, on this program many times. Tiant always had a big old cigar in his mouth, and I just didn't want to throw up on him, or on my shoes, or Steve Balboni. To the extent that the Hall of Fame matters to me, or it can matter to Louis Tiant now, and it can't matter much at all, I think he has an extremely good case. I alluded to that last episode, and the remainder of this episode will relate to that in a sense. As you know, from our last few meetings, I've been reading Kevin Baker's History of New York Baseball, the New York Game, and one thing Mr. Baker did very well, extremely well, is that he points out again and again that in early baseball, white Protestants were allowed to play, white Catholics were allowed, Irish were allowed, Italians were allowed, Germans were allowed. At one point early on, the game pretty much was Irish and German. I spent quite a bit of time this week working on a story for you, and we may get to it eventually, about the turn of the 20th century outfielder Honest John Anderson, an early Dodger and Yankee who was born in Norway. So immigrant Vikings were allowed. Light-skinned Latin Americans were allowed. Armando Marsans and Dolph Luke with the Reds, they were from Cuba. America first, that's the movement, right? But America took Cubans first and African Americans last. If you want to be even more accurate, you could say they took everyone first, but blacks and women, that's another story. I know I've gone on about that book a lot, but it's been my focus for the past few weeks as I prepare for the moderation I'm doing at the Morristown Festival of Books on October 19th. You could look it up. I have a broader, more timely point to make, though, because it relates to a few things that are happening right now or that we've discussed lately on this program. When I talked about Pete Rose and his self-indulgent special pleading regarding the refusal of baseball to allow him to receive the gold watch that is a Hall of Fame plaque, I talked about all the players who didn't break the rules, who had, in their own ways, just as much reason to feel thwarted, living or dead, whether they're in the baseball heaven waiting room or not. My point was that every player who has an argument to be in but isn't is equal in the fact that they haven't been admitted. The injustice, if there is one, if there is no overall disqualifying factor, is the same. But of course, there is one in Charlie Hustle's case. Remember, the qualifier is not necessarily statistics. There's no automatic entry based on a pile of numbers. it's subjective. I've been reading about the Cathars too. I believe I mentioned that. Well, in their theology, you were either one of the perfect or you were not. The word perfect really doesn't have a lot of flexibility to it. You were either meeting their moral standards or you were going to get kicked back down to have another trip around the wheel of life, which in their opinion sucked. Or maybe it just sucked compared to where you were going to get to go if you were, in fact, perfect. And that, of course, was to be subsumed into the Godhead. But putting that aside, being a Hall of Famer, which is to say being worthy of getting a gold medal from baseball, is kind of similar. Babe Ruth is a Hall of Famer, and Rabbit Moranville is a Hall of Famer. Ron Santo is a Hall of Famer, and Lou Brock is a Hall of Famer, and none of these guys is exactly alike, but they are all alike in that they were adjudged to be over that line, whatever it is that says, yes, we will give them this medal. It's different from being one of the perfect in that they had guidelines that were carefully spelled out, delineated, and if you varied from them even slightly, you were out of the club. And everyone else you had invited into the club was also out of the club, no matter how perfect they were, which strikes me as being terribly unfair. And maybe I'm reading that wrong, but that's what I've gotten out of it so far. The Hall of Fame is not like that. It's blurry. We just say, okay, he's one of them. It's not just the number of hits or the number of home runs or the number of wins or saves or stolen bases. It's the judgment. And thus, there's no difference between Pete Rose and a whole bunch of other guys, except for the one big thing that he didn't like to admit to or talk about. And to make this argument last time, I used a quartet of third basemen from the 60s and 70s as my symbols. I also mentioned El Tiante, and I mentioned briefly that there are still deserving Negro Leaguers out there who were sinned against, not sinning, but I didn't go into any detail, and I'd like to do that a little bit more just now for the remainder of the program without doing full-on biographies of each of these gentlemen. It is often said that when the great Giants manager John McGraw passed away, a list was found among his papers, I believe his wife Blanche found it, a list of the players of color he would have signed had the color line not existed. That always bugged me because if anyone had the power and prestige to agitate for a change to that rule, the unwritten rule that was the color line, it was John J. McGraw. But if he did so, it never reached the public. According to John Riley's book on the Negro Leagues, that list was 4 names long. The players McGraw listed were shortstop John Henry Lloyd, Pop Lloyd, the outfielder Spotswood Poles, and the pitchers Joe Williams and Dick Redding. Joe was known as either Cyclone Joe or Smokey Joe, and Dick Redding was called Cannonball Dick Redding. And it makes sense that McGraw would have zeroed in on that quartet because he saw them a lot. All 4 played for the New York Lincoln Giants beginning in 1912. It's important to note, and I will mention this again in a bit, that is about 8 years before Rube Foster and his associates organized the Negro National League. This was an inchoate period for black baseball. That's how long ago it was. But the Lincoln Giants were very good. Parenthetically, they were called the New York Lincoln Giants because the team actually got organized in Nebraska, but ended up playing in New York where the money was. They were very good, and they played a lot of exhibitions against McGraw's Giants over the years and generally kicked ass. Both Williams and Redding were very hard throwers by the standards of the day, whose off-speed stuff seems to be a bit in question. They threw so hard and were so good at spotting the fastball in and out, up and down, that they didn't need too much in the way of a curve or a slider. Baseball Reference has Joe Williams at 6'3", 190 pounds, but some of the history books have him as bigger and heavier. Certainly in photographs, he looks like Aaron Judge, at least in comparison to the players who were standing around him, who on average would have been much shorter than he was given the way Americans shaped up at that time. He was from Texas, his dad was black, and his mother was a full-blooded Native American. Because we have incomplete stats, and we have to debate what even is a stat given all the non-league games that teams like the Lincoln Giants played, his record looks more like that of a very good modern reliever rather than a starting pitcher of the 1910s and 20s. I am absolutely cherry-picking here, but if you take Williams' 1917 and 18 seasons as they are presented up to the moment and add them together, you get a record of 20-6 in 235.2 innings with a 1.34 ERA, 63 walks, and 163 strikeouts. Or if you want, you can cut it back in half again, and you get Goose Gossage in his prime. Redding was born in Atlanta in 1890. That's the same year Casey Stengel was born in Missouri, but he didn't get Casey's opportunities for obvious reasons. He wasn't as physically imposing as Williams, although he was also a big guy. Pitchers usually are among the taller guys on the team, and of course you know that scouts select against shorter pitchers. If we do the same cherry-picking stunt with him, we can take the 1916 season, when he was with the Lincoln Giants, and his 1917 season, when he pitched for Foster on the Chicago American Giants. That gets you 22-5 in 234 and a third innings with a 1.38 ERA, 67 walks, and 161 strikeouts. Spotswood Poles, or Spot Poles, as they called him. That's a great name. I love baseball names. He was a leadoff type outfielder, a 5'7" switch hitter. He hit for average, was very fast. The historian John Holway says that he was called the Black Ty Cobb, as John Henry Lloyd was called the Black Honus Wagner. Wagner said he was honored by the comp, but I don't know that Cobb said anything on the matter. The hitting records of both players are so fragmentary that it's harder for me to play that same game we just enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed it with Williams and Redding. But if you look, you'll see a whole bunch of high averages, just in small samples. I also want to note that several of these players saw action in the First World War. Poles, in particular, was decorated multiple times for bravery in combat and is buried in the Arlington National Cemetery. Pop Lloyd played forever, and to the extent that his stats exist, they do look sort of Wagnerish. Poles is harder to figure, but broadly speaking, he seems like the kind of player who would have fit in on Whitey Herzog's Cardinals teams. Batted both ways, hit line drives, was very fast. One of his teammates said he was faster than Cool Papa Bell. It seems like just about every book on the Negro Leagues, or black baseball in general, cites a poll that the Pittsburgh Courier ran in 1952, the Courier being one of those newspapers directed at a black audience. They set up a team of experts. I'm not exactly sure who they were. It seems like there were about 40 of them to pick an all-time black baseball all-star team. They chose Buck Leonard at first base, Jackie Robinson for second, Oliver Marcel, a later New York Lincoln Giant, for third base, Pop Lloyd at short, Josh Gibson and Biz Mackey as the backstops, and going around the outfield from left field to right field, Monty Irvin, Oscar Charleston, and Cristobal Torriente. Smokey Joe edged Satchel Paige by one vote for the all-time best pitcher. Redding just missed making the team, but they listed him as the first pitcher on the second team. Functionally, I think that meant that the voters felt that he was about the fifth best pitcher of all time, and there's certainly no shame or insult in that. When it came time for the Hall of Fame to think about admitting some of these gentlemen, they really suffered for how much time had passed. And as it turned out, of the quartet we've been discussing, Smokey Joe Williams and Pop Lloyd are in, Poles and Redding are not. There's no concrete reason for that. I do think that John Henry Lloyd and Smokey Joe Williams had better word of mouth, and the stats, as we've said, are so fragmentary that carried outsized weight when it came to these deliberations. In John Holway's book, Voices from the Great Black Baseball Leagues in Oral History, Ted Page, an outfielder whose career lasted from 1926 to 1937, says, "Old-timers will tell you stories about men like Redding and Joe Williams and John Henry Lloyd. I don't think you can appreciate what these men meant to baseball, what kind of ball players they were. And you couldn't, not fully, because players like Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige were of the second generation, a generation that was within living memory, and in 1952, in many cases, still playing. Paige, Irvin, and of course Jackie Robinson had played in the formerly segregated major leagues. Poles stopped playing when Babe Ruth was still young. In addition, I don't think anyone did him any favors when they said, oh, he's faster than Cool Papa Bell. Because Bell was so fast and there were people around who had seen him play. So it must have been so very easy to dismiss what they said about Puls as hyperbole. This year, the fastest player by sprint speed in the major leagues was Bobby Witt Jr. Now, I grew up watching Rickey Henderson. If you told me that Bobby Witt Jr. is faster than Rickey Henderson, well, it would be tempting again to say, oh, come on. Did you see Pete Crow Armstrong run out his inside the park home run towards the end of the season? He was in the top, I think, 5 in terms of sprint speed this year. I don't know that I've seen anyone do that as fast as he did it. I don't know what the objective time was on the stopwatch, but the thing that was amazing was that when most players start getting winded in that last 100 feet or so, he was accelerating. I think, and I say this without exaggeration, he launched himself down the third base line towards the end of that run and flew the last 20 feet or so. He was so fast, he achieved liftoff. Now, you want to tell me Ty Cobb was faster than that? I don't know. Was Cole Papa Bell faster than that? I don't know. Was Spots Puls, who was faster than Cole Papa Bell, who was faster than Ty Cobb, faster than that? It starts to sound like science fiction, doesn't it? Cannonball Dick Redding lasted longer than Puls did, but as the years went by, he became a manager who gave himself the occasional spot start. So to have seen him in his prime, you'd have to have been, again, paying attention in the early 1920s at latest, and it was more than half a century after that the Hall even thought about erasing its own color line. Lloyd and Williams, as I said, were so legendary and had had such long careers that they were easier to visualize even if they were long dead by the time the Hall got around to getting over itself. All of them have been gone a very long time. Redding left this world in 1948, way too young, but he was very ill. Williams checked out in 1951, Puls left in 1962, and Pop Lloyd in 1964. Had they been around like Pete Rose was, they could have advocated for themselves and each other, but they weren't. They could have argued that they too had gotten a raw deal, given that their only crime was too much of a certain pigment of choosing the wrong parents. Since Rose passed, I've seen many people talking about the Hall's hypocrisy in having some creeps in and keeping others out, which is an odd argument to make in favor of your guy, as if 2 wrongs made a right, or if there was ever any consistency to the Hall of Fame thing at all. But to the extent that the enshrinement of any dead player matters, and please forgive my language, ladies and gentlemen, I don't usually talk like this on the program, but it's called for here. My asshole dickhead candidate wasn't any more of an asshole than the assholes already in there. Strategy of persuasion? That's particularly weak compared to the wholly asshole-free case for players like Spotswood Puls and Cannonball Dick Redding, who didn't do anything except show up to the wrong America at the wrong time. They have that in common with so many who have come after, including some who are showing up now. We don't need to prejudge them, as we prejudged Redding and Puls and Lloyd and Williams and the rest. We were that America once, but there's no reason for us to be that America again. Hey, the show really was a little bit shorter this time. Should you wish to follow me on social media, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. I've been a lot more present during the playoffs. I like having games to comment on. Should you wish to write us, by which I mean me, you can do so at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on the Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. We've had 17 couples meet and marry over the 7 years of well, not really, but it could happen. Should you and your future partner who you met in the Infinite Inning Facebook group wish to support the show, please go to patreon.com/The Infinite Inning. Gear of a rudimentary kind suitable for weddings at teespring.com/store/the-infinite-inning. Original soundtrack available gratis and suitable for your first dance at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare when you're not busy courting, go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, there's always a dating app, right? Our theme song, which you are hearing now, I don't know what's wrong with me, folks, I'm punchy. Our theme song, which you're hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who reminds you there is no freedom without happiness and no happiness without freedom. The politics of liberation is the politics of joy. In other words, put me in, coach. I'm ready to play. Well, if it does not, in the course of human events, become necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, Then I will be back next week with more tales from inside the welcoming harbor we call the Infinite Inning.